Subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button. Click the bell button and enjoy the latest uploads from our channel.
He made trade concessions to China after its government agreed to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in a Trump-branded resort. He announced a modest trade enforcement action on steel and aluminum and declared it a trade war, something both good and easy to win. He then shifted his sights in this combat from China to Canada without any apparent rationale. The president has even threatened Ecuador's economy with crippling sanctions if its government offered public support for breastfeeding. As with so many Trump debacles, his bluster creates an appearance of radicalism, a dramatic break with a stable and happy consensus. Washington Post columnist Catherine Rampell has lamented that he is discarding more than 300 years of settled economic knowledge. Nobel laureate economist Paul Krugman has been more modest, accusing Trump of jeopardizing a free trade system that dates back to former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's easy to forget that just before Trump's election, elite Washington was rethinking the approach to free trade and globalization that the United States had taken since the 1990s. Centrist think tanks held major conferences calling to restructure the U.S. relationship with China. Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren and even libertarian experts at the Cato Institute agreed there were serious problems with the way trade agreements were enforced. Part of the trouble is that Trump is not pursuing a coherent and consistent trade strategy. On some matters, he's hard to distinguish from Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, while on others, he does break with the recent past. But even here Trump is not the destroyer of order and harmony, but the product of a corrupt and broken system. To understand what's going on and where it went wrong, we need to start at the beginning. What economists are accustomed to describing as free trade or globalization has another, less flattering name: colonialism. Human beings have been trading across political borders for as long as human beings have recorded their activity. But free trade in the modern sense was the conceptual innovation of David Ricardo, a brilliant 19th-century British economist. In his 1817 magnum opus on the principles of political economy and taxation, Ricardo laid out the theory of comparative advantage. If every country focused on producing what it made best, and then traded with other countries that did the same, everybody everywhere would get to enjoy the best of everything. In the process, Ricardo argued, every country would become richer this way than it would if it tried to produce everything at home by itself. To illustrate the point, Ricardo presented a thought experiment in which two countries, Britain and Portugal, produced just two commodities, wine and cloth. In the 19th century, Portugal was famous for its wine, while European nobility coveted fine British textiles. Imports of good Portuguese wine were tough on British winemakers, and if the British government wanted to protect its domestic wineries, it could put up tariffs against Portuguese wine, making the foreign stuff more expensive in British stores. And that could be just fine for winemakers. But there are only so many workers. Someone who spends the day smashing grapes can't devote that same time to running a loom. Tariffs couldn't change the root problems with the British wine business. The soil and climate on a rocky semi-Arctic island just weren't good for grapes. As a result, propping up the inefficient British wine industry would sap resources from its much more productive textile operations. This waste would register as lower overall production of both wine and cloth. And perhaps worst of all, it would mean British drinkers would have to settle for their own lousy wine. The obvious solution was for politicians to keep out of the way and let people do what they would naturally do absent government meddling, trade freely. Under a system of perfectly free commerce, each country naturally devotes its capital and labor to such employments as are most beneficial to each, Ricardo wrote. This pursuit of individual advantage is admirably connected with the universal good of the whole. Ricardo was onto something. But he took an awful lot for granted to make his point. He didn't have much to say, for instance, about how the British textile business actually operated. In the real world, England's spinning and weaving factories relied on cotton from India and the United States. This cotton was cheap, and the British factories, by extension, so wonderfully efficient, Because plantation owners relied on slave labor and violent exploitation to keep down costs. By focusing on Ricardo's abstract trade model, economists and policymakers could be lulled into understanding these acts of violent subjugation as components of an